Julia back up to the podium, and Julia's going to now be talking about walking the stream as protection, when wet-dry mapping can help protect streams.
Okay, so how many people have participated at some point in the past in wet-dry mapping? Show of hands? Quite a few people. Very good. So this presentation is more about how some of the data are used. So with that, let's start. So I'm going to be using terms here based on the USGS definitions. There are multiple definitions of what these words mean. Right now there's a proposed rule for the Clean Water Act that might change some of those definitions. But usually a perennial stream is one that flows year-round without cease. An intermittent stream is one that flows only seasonally, and usually that's due either to the presence of a groundwater table or the repeated runoff from snowmelt. And then we have ephemeral streams, which are Arizona's most common type of stream, where it only flows in direct response to the precipitation regime, and the channel is always separate or above the water table. So the first example, I'm going to draw from the Cienega Creek as examples of how wet-dry data have been used in the past to either protect or not protect the stream in some ways. So this first example comes from Emprida Ranch. This is Cienega Creek at Interstate Highway 10, and this was part of a proposed development of 15,000 houses that was going to be built there. And as part of it may interest you to know that the first wet-dry maps were done for this development by the developer. They sponsored a study to look at whether the stream was ephemeral or not, because after the 1983 flood, when they purchased the property in that time frame, and it flowed for years underneath the bridge at that location. And so they started a mapping project to do wet-dry mapping. They did it 4 times a year for 10 years. And they also used USGS gauges, and they did pump tests down here in the area of the proposed development to look at how this stream should be classified. And this particular map was done in 1986. And back then, since there were no cottonwood trees to obscure the channel, what they did is they actually flew it. They flew a plane over the channel, and they marked on a USGS topo map, eyeballing it, where the stream was flowing or not. So these show the 4 quarterly stream flow measurements. And this was the last time that the flow was recorded to run continuously underneath the bridge. That was in 1986, 3 years after the 1983 flood did all of that groundwater recharge. So, and the reason that it was important, here's the proposed Emprida Ranch development right there. The reason it was important was because under the state law, if you have a perennial stream and you're going to pump, or you're going to situate your proposed wells in the channel, you would need surface water rights if it were classified as perennial. And this particular developer did not have surface water rights, so they needed to prove that it was ephemeral. And that ultimately was correct and was accepted by the ADWR, that they did not need surface water rights. So again, it looks like a failure in terms of conservation of the stream. They were going to put in the wells in the alluvial channel gravels upstream of what the flood control district had just purchased. The proposed development was upstream of the Cienega Creek Natural Preserve. After the developer stopped doing the monitoring, I asked PAG to continue the work. And so that's when the foot surveys began. And the data that PAG, and there was a whole succession of people at PAG who had done this work over many years, the data that they put together showing this relationship between the depth to water at Emprida Ranch upstream of Interstate 10 to the flow length downstream in the flood control district's property was part of the motivation for Pima County to negotiate with the developer the terms under which that future development would proceed. And ultimately, the county basically just bought the land, and that development never happened. The second example of using wet-dry information comes from Davidson Canyon. And it's important for you to understand that in Arizona, the numeric standards for certain constituents in terms of water quality protection are less stringent for streams that are classified as ephemeral than for those that are classified as perennial or intermittent. And it's not like the state has godlike knowledge about, what is perennial, intermittent, and ephemeral. And it's also, the fact that judges demonstrated to you that there's conditions, natural conditions make these streams highly variable. So reasonable people can differ in terms of their understanding of whether a stream, is classified one way or the other. And so this was one example. So in Davidson Canyon, in 1990, the state did a study that they call a use attainability analysis. They sent out a hydrologist who walked part of Davidson Canyon and said, "This sure looks like an ephemeral stream to me." And I heard about that, and I was like, "Have you been to the parts of Davidson that I've been to? Because we have fish and frogs." This is David Scalero. He's netting some fish out of Davidson Canyon on our county property. And I said, you really need to come out here and see, the rest of Davidson Canyon, because part of it is flowing year-round. And so ultimately, we were able to establish that, yes, there are parts of Davidson Canyon that do have, at that time, perennial flow, and went on for many years. But now, that same area that had the fish and frogs would be considered intermittent, not perennial. We wanted to assure that the county's part of Davidson Canyon had the highest quality protection available under the state water quality standards, because one of the things is that Davidson Canyon provides underflow to Cienega Creek from the higher parts of the Santa Rita Mountains. So it sometimes flows out of phase from the main stem of Cienega Creek. Sometimes Davidson's high when Cienega's low, and vice versa. And it also provides a lower salinity of water. This is total dissolved solids, and you can see that Cienega Creek, just upstream of Davidson, has a higher natural total dissolved solids level than does Davidson. So we want to protect that higher quality water that's coming in there. So we put together some data, we sent it to the state, and to ask for a high level of protection under the state law, something that would prohibit the state from issuing permits that would degrade the water quality in the part of Davidson Canyon that we own. And that is part of why the Rosemont Mine has gotten the scrutiny it has, is this protective designation. It's called Outstanding Waters now. It used to be called Unique Waters Program. But it basically says that the state can't issue a permit to degrade the water quality. And so in reviewing the impacts of the Rosemont Mine, the state and the federal government were compelled to examine this issue of water quality impacts very closely. And they came up with differences. EPA said that issuing the permit for the mine would significantly degrade the water quality, but the state said that there would be no impact to the water quality. And that's why it was ultimately, the decision was kicked up to a very high level in the Corps of Engineers for a decision. And this is a very unusual process. I think it's happened maybe 5 times in the past, ever in the nation, to go to this higher level of scrutiny. Ultimately, they decided to issue a permit. Concurrent with this was an effort just last year by the mines in the state of Arizona to diminish this program for water quality protection that's called the Outstanding Arizona Waters Program. The mines have proposed to change the standards to remove some of the existing outstanding water designations, including the one for Davidson Canyon, and to limit or make more difficult any new designations, in part because this does impose a higher level of scrutiny on future development than would otherwise be the case. We opposed that this year and were successful, but I'm not sure that that will continue or not. I'm not even sure that we'll have an outstanding waters program with some of the proposed changes in the Clean Water Act in the future. That is a program that's under the Clean Water Act framework. My next example comes from Barrel Canyon. Barrel Canyon is, if you drive it into the Rosemont area, you'll drive right on up the stream. It's usually dry. It's an ephemeral stream. I think most people would regard this as an ephemeral stream. So here is the mine site, shown in gray. And these are some groundwater monitoring wells here. Here's the Sonoyta Highway. And here's where the Sonoyta Highway crosses Barrel Canyon. So there's a culvert there, and there's a USGS gauge. So there is a point downstream of the gauge, at and downstream of the gauge, where the stream flows sometimes. Perhaps you've driven the Sonoyta Highway and you've looked down into that bedrock area and you can see the water flowing sometimes when there's nothing happening in the watershed. You look over there and you can see no rain, it's falling. And yet it still flows downstream. And so we're having an argument right now about whether that's actually ephemeral or intermittent. So, I brought up the fact that historic maps show Beryl Spring. They label it. It was an important place for people to get water historically. This is an 1894 map, I think, that the Pima County Surveyor did. It's part of what was supporting ranch life back then. We have USGS gauge data. We have stream flow observations. Okay, so here's a flood hydrograph, and you see sharp peaks. But what happens is the flow persists sometimes for many days afterwards. And here's the gauge, and you can see, the water is flowing over there. It's a nice clear day, and here's the bedrock, that's helping keep the water to the surface. And so that's an important feature because what it means is that if there is the infiltration through the tailings, there's no liner. It goes into the aquifer and it discharges. And springs are where it discharges. And this is a spring. And this is in May of this year. It was continuing to flow. Perhaps you saw it. But the thing is that the state water quality standards assume that this is an ephemeral stream. And that's because of something called the tributary rule. So the tributary rule, because there's no special standard for Barrel Canyon, it assumes that every stream in Arizona that is not listed specifically in the state water quality standards, it assumes that it's ephemeral. And you have to get it entered into the records through proving that it's intermittent or perennial, and the state has to accept that information, and they only accept it during rulemaking. And so information about the presence of intermittent and perennial streams influences the water quality standards for every stream in Arizona. So if you want your data to have meaning, it's important to get it recognized by the state through the rulemaking process. I really do feel that this classification system of intermittent, perennial, and ephemeral, it's useful to an extent, but it shouldn't obscure some important relationships. This is an ephemeral stream, no argument there. But you can see it has a riparian forest that suffered some dieback during droughts. There are many streams in Arizona that are ephemeral, but they have shallow water tables where people historically dug a shallow well and used that to start their homestead. And most of our riparian forests, at least in Pima County, are along ephemeral streams that have shallow water tables that never reach the surface. They would be classified as ephemeral. That's the great majority of broadly riparian forests is along the stream type. And then as Jeff pointed out in his presentation, this is just kind of a close-up micro scale. There's surface water flow here, it's dry here, and there's surface water flow there. Now why would you have different water quality standards between those two places? It's part of the same river. So I mean, ultimately, some of these classification systems really don't make sense. So in conclusion, ephemeral streams have less protection in the state of Arizona, and so wet-dry information is relevant. If you want to have an effect on the state water quality standards, you really do need to bring these data forward through the rulemaking process, because our state uses a flow regime classification to decide what standards apply. I believe that that's not the optimum, but that's the way it is. And I would like for policymakers to recognize these shallow groundwater systems. An ephemeral stream with a shallow groundwater system is so much more easily polluted than an ephemeral stream where the water table may be hundreds of feet below the surface. That's a really different condition, and people's health depend on it. So thank you.
We have time for one question. If you could use the mic for the questions. If there are.
The question is this on? No, there's a button. Oh, so my question is
related to the classification spatially. Are those classifications set by like stream order, or so for a given reach of stream, or are they set by something else that could be more spatially explicit?
The condition of this variation spatially in what's flowing, over time, is one that the state system doesn't accommodate very well at all. They have no rules about it, and it's been a source of conflict, I would say, on Davidson Canyon. When we proposed the designation to protect our spring on the county lands, it was opposed, and initially the state would not accept it because the reach that we wanted to protect was interrupted. It had some perennial flow, then it was ephemeral, then it was perennial. And the mines were saying, well, that can't be designated as an outstanding water because it contains, in between the perennial reaches, this ephemeral reach. The state ultimately did accept it, but again, it's natural variability doesn't fit well into these classification systems. And so reasonable people can argue about these things.
Would there be a better
system that would there be a better system you might propose than
maybe either riparian vegetation or some kind of depth to groundwater classification that would add the protection that you seek?
Well, I think the existing Clean Water Act is set up actually pretty well. The question is how you interpret it and whether you use flow regime. The Clean Water Act doesn't require doesn't require a state to use flow regime as their criterion. This Clean Water Act is supposed to protect uses. So if people are using shallow groundwater in wells, I think that is the kind of water quality use that needs to be considered. The fact that it's so easy to contaminate those wells that rely on shallow groundwater. That's a use that needs to be protected, and I think the state could interpret that and protect that today without any rule change, but they don't.